it on. Put that Float Tank podcast on. Listen to our tracks at the motherfucking break of dawn. Listen to our tracks while you mow your back and front your lawns. Listen in your bed with your lover while you get it on. Don't switch to NPR just because you go to drive to work inside your car. And when there's sports games on at the bar, just pull your phone, go and hit play, put on a podcast every damn day.
My section's gonna be a little bit calmer. I actually don't really mind what you do, so just keep living your life however you want to. I mean, I'm not really in a position to be demanding you to do things. Like, I've only got my life so together, you know? Like, sometimes it feels like it's barely being held together and it could all come crashing down at any moment. I mean, like, I'd really appreciate some advice if you have some thoughts on what you think might be helpful for me to hear.
Hey everyone.
Hey guys.
This is Graham over here.
This is Ashkahn.
You're listening to the Daily Solutions podcast. That's in right. Case the intro didn't make that clear.
I guess, yeah, we didn't really mention that explicitly, but I think I got the right message across.
Is that the feeling of it is there. We got some big news.
Yeah.
Final episode is coming up, which means it'll be the last one.
Yeah.
And it's gonna be a doozy. It's going to be a big one. We're going to do 2 straight hours, unrelenting question answering. Coming up into this month.
That's right. November 29th, 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock. That's how long 2 hours is.
Until, we'll say. 3:25 sounds confusing.
That specific time.
Yeah, good one.
Yeah.
Otherwise, that could be bad.
And you can call in with questions, and it's going to be great. And we're going to have information about, like, how you can call in and stuff eventually. Like, it'll be...
Yeah.
Or maybe right now in the show notes. I'm not really sure. If it's there, then cool. If it's not, like, it'll be there sometime.
Yeah, but, go on our Facebook page, subscribe to our mailing list, send us money. Wait, no, that one wasn't necessary. But all the other ones, you'll be updated as to what's going on, when our live episode is.
Cool.
Where to call.
Cool.
So again, that was kind of rambly, but the main thing, Thursday, November 29th, 3 to 5 p.m. Pacific time.
Yeah.
Set it aside.
Yeah.
It'll be great.
Hit it.
All right. And we got a question in the meantime, which will kind of fulfill our obligation here as
it's called
Q&A podcast host.
Thing.
Yeah. The question is, I have 30 minutes between every customer. How long do I need to run my pump for? I'm following your advice of not running it while people are in the tank, but I don't even like running it while they're still in the room because of the noise.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I hear you.
Yeah. That's the balance.
Yeah, and it's a pretty common situation too. Like, I'd say the most common transition time between customers is 30 minutes. And that's kind of the time from when you turn on the music for one person to get out of the tank till when the next customer has the room to themselves to kind of shower off and start floating. At least in our center, that's what it means.
Yeah, and so there's obviously a huge benefit to being able to run your pump for less time, because it just means all of this goes easier for your transition and you can get people in earlier.
Ideally, it would be like instantaneous. You're like, bloop, and like all the dirty water goes out and just clean water is like, you're just in there.
Yeah, a lot of cool sound effects. Like,
But things don't happen like that.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the basics.
Okay. Yeah, I love basics.
Pumps?
Well, actually, what are we doing here? What are questions? So, I mean, I guess, first of all, I think one of the basics is this idea of not running the pump when people are in the tank, which is worth mentioning again, and is something we've warned about on this podcast before.
Oh, sure, yeah. Don't want to do that.
It's scary. It's scary having the pump turn on when there are people in there.
Yeah, so there are, things you can... There's potentially a danger that a pump running while somebody's inside the system could lead to what they call entrapment, where if a part of their body blocks the pipe sucking liquid in, that could cause them to be kind of vacuumed onto it if they don't have some other pipe, and or hair can get sucked up into a system like that. These are kind of the dangers that are very realistic and could happen. There are ways to design float tanks that can alleviate those. So this isn't really like a universal thing. You'll have to look at your actual float tank, and again, there's entrapment because of suction, and there's entrapment because of hair going through, and different things like that to consider. But it's a good thing to know about and to realize if your float tank doesn't have those kind of safeguards, then you really don't want to be running the pump while somebody's in there, because it could potentially be dangerous.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the biggest things, I guess, to just know about your system in my mind that can lead to especially kind of hair entanglement, entrapment is just like if your pump is in the same room as the tank and they're really close together, which it sounds like they are for the person sending in the question, if the noise is kind of coming through and too loud, then you have a very short distance between where someone's head and hair is and where the pump is. And I think that's one of the scariest things. Anyway, so that's good.
Scary.
I just wanted to mention it because I think that was a good aside in the question that's worth highlighting.
No, that was our scary fact for the episode.
Whew, okay. So on to other basics,
Pumps.
Yep, filters.
So all the stuff, their pumps are pumping. And
yep,
they're
and your
pumping
filters
liquid.
are filtering. Ideally, this is an ideal world we're talking about here.
I mean, both those things are really true. But the
Ozoners
question is, how are they pumping? How well are they pumping, and how well are they filtering?
Yep, yeah.
So pumps are usually moving the liquid at a certain speed, right? When we're here in the U.S., we use gallons per minute. In places that use the metric system, like the entire rest of the world, it's liters per minute. And so that's how we're usually measuring what they call the flow rate. And basically, this kind of number, this concept of how fast the liquid is moving, is used in a lot of calculations to figure out how long you should be running your pump.
Yep, yeah, for sure. And
in some cases.
So there's two different kinds of main systems that are used for float tanks, and they sort of have different answers to this. Well, every float tank is going to have a different answer, first of all. There's not like a set amount of time and then the water's filtered. It has to deal with all the details.
But there's like two fundamental
we're going into,
groups.
But the two big groups are having a reservoir type system where all the water leaves the tank and kind of goes through the filter to a storage tank and then back into the float tank from there. And then the other one is a
recirculation
there
system.
We go, yeah. I made a gesture, and Ashkahn picked up that the word wasn't coming.
I get it.
Thanks, buddy.
It's an alley-oop. So a recirculation system is where the pipes and everything that the whole filtration system is connected with, instead of emptying from the float tank into some external vat, just connects right back into the basin of the float tank. So the liquid's just being kind of shot right back in as soon as it goes through the whole filtration system.
And that's the most common type of float tank.
Here in the U.S. and North America and in a lot of countries that we see those a lot more often.
I'd say just of manufacturers, in the world.
And also that, yeah.
There's probably like 90% of float tanks are recirculation and maybe 10% are reservoir. So
the reason why those things are different is because of the kind of hydrodynamics of what's going on in the float tank, right? Like what you're trying to do is get the liquid in your float tank to go through your filtration system.
Sounds easy, right? What could possibly go wrong?
So, obviously the stuff in your filtration system is cleaning things and the liquid has to go through it. And so when you have this recirculation model where the liquid's going right back into the float tank, then that liquid is mixing with stuff that is sitting there and hasn't gone through yet. And because it's all like mixing together and going and swirling around, it means you're not really getting uniquely 100% of the solution in your float tank to go through the filter in a single pass, So when you look at something like, hey, I have a pump that does 50 gallons per minute and I have a float tank that holds 200 gallons in it, then simple math would say if every minute 50 gallons are going through this filtration system, and if there's 200 gallons in this tank, then in 4 minutes, 200 gallons have gone through. So all 200 gallons of my float tank have gone through. But, obviously where that breaks down is the fact that everything is mixing together. So it means 200 gallons have gone through, but it doesn't mean
a unique 200 gallons.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the reservoir system, it is just kind of simple like that because you have a float tank that's literally emptying into an external vat.
So 100% of the water is going through the filter system.
Like it has to go through the filter system to get to the vat, and then you do it back, so it kind of goes through 2 times.
In some systems.
Some just bring it right back. So that's the logic that makes that kind of easier. So we'll kind of set those aside for a second because the complexity...
And if you have those, then the answer is just however long it takes to go into the reservoir and back into the tank is how long your filtration needs to be between people.
Right.
Because then all of it has gone through the filter. So that's a simple one. So if you do have a reservoir system, done, we just answered your question.
There'll be some other things to say later about that. So just tuck it away, tuck it on the shelf for the moment. But remember that it's there.
Great. So recirculation systems then.
So for the recirculation system, the question becomes, well, how do we get more unique liquid to go through the system? And the answer is
we listened to some guys from the 1920s called Gage and Bidwell. Yeah, who came up with the Gage-Bidwell law of dilution, which basically says that every turnover, not 100% of the solution in the float tank is going through a filter, or when they were doing it for pools, just pool water.
And a turnover, we forgot to say what that is.
Oh boy, yeah, that's it's a pastry, typically, something like apple or peach.
It's a turnover is what I described a second ago, which is like you have a pump that does 50 gallons per minute. You have 200 gallons in your system. That means every 4 minutes, 200 gallons has gone through. You use that kind of simplified reality math to call 4 minutes a single turnover. So
but we're even like it's volumetric turnover, I think is what that's short for, because it's the full volume is being turned over. Right. So what they pretty much did was figure out what the actual ratio of water that's being mixed back in is. And then from there, you'd expect a certain amount of that to, during the next turnover of the filter system, also get partially filtered. So anything that wasn't touched during the first turnover, now part of that is actually going through the filter cycle. And so that number ends up being 63% for when you're doing a turnover with a pump. Again, for them it was in a pool. For us, it's a float tank. 63% of the volume of that is actually going through the filter during a full volumetric turnover.
And this is, these are kind of statistics, so that means there's a little like margin of error there. But yeah, there's a margin of error for all these things. But basically, the more turnovers you do, the higher percentage of unique liquid going through the system that you get. So for one turnover, you get typically 63% going through. I think I usually see like plus or minus 3% when I see that number. Mm-hmm. At 2 turnovers, they say it's 86%. At 3 turnovers, you're up to 95%. At 4, it's 98%. At 5, it's 99.3%. At 6, it's 99.7%. At 10, it's 99.99%. And it's never going to hit 100 because this is all just, again, kind of statistics approaching 100.
Sorry to break it to you, people with recirculation pumps out there, but you're never going to filter 100% of your water. By the logic of this, actually, you still have at least one little bit of water in there from the very first time you filter.
One drop, just holding on.
Yep, that hasn't been through your filter at all. So that's kind of terrifying, huh? Who knows what that drop of water holds?
So that's the concept. Basically, the more you turn over, the better you're moving all this stuff through your system.
Man, I really wanted the end of that sentence to rhyme with turnover. Like, the more you turn over, the more you're grown over, Only like grown over would mean like...
Would have an actual real
yeah,
meaning.
Exactly.
Yeah, that would have been cool.
I wanted to say, too, you can do this math at home if you have a piece of paper and a pencil, too.
And a computer. Just type it into Google.
But all of it's just you're taking 63%, and then you're taking 63% of the remaining amount and adding that to the first 63%, and then doing the same for the rest of it. So it actually just goes on the same rate.
Exponential decay model.
Yep. It's fun. If you have free time, I totally suggest
it. Super fun, yeah. So the immediate question becomes, well, how many of these
who
are
are these Gage Bidwell suckers?
Yeah, who are these guys?
No, what were you going to say?
What percentage are we shooting for? And that's where things get a little bit more complicated, because there's a couple other variables here, which is that the pieces of your sanitation system also only have a certain amount of efficacy. So it's not like 100% of what goes through your filter is going to be perfectly filtered, or 100% of what goes through your UV is going to perfectly be destroyed by the UV. So you also have to keep in mind that the rest of the components don't have perfect 100% marks on them, and that those percentages get knocked off of this kind of Gage-Bidwell logic for how effective these things actually are. And the efficacy is not as generic as this other stuff we're talking about, because you're talking about, how good is your filter at filtering out some specific thing like cryptosporidium, or how good is your UV at killing cryptosporidium. That's where you start using the kind of efficacy of those different things. So it's not quite the same, but when we're talking about filters and sanitation systems being affected and using those numbers, you have to realize there's kind of both those variables, and that's where the reservoir systems come back into play.
Oh, wait, I had one more. More actually for these ones before we get into that.
That was it. That was all I had to say about the reservoir. Affects reservoir systems.
Oh.
Like, they also have filtration systems that aren't 100% effective, right? So you have to also just remember that logic with those, even though 100% is going through. So you put it back on the shelf now.
Wait, it was already on the shelf. You
Yeah,
mean
well,
take it off the
they
shelf?
took it off
take it off and
while
then
I was
now it's
saying
back
that,
on.
and they were looking at it. Now
Now it's back. Okay,
Now
I
it's
got it.
sitting
No, I
there.
think I tracked its full shelf
Yeah.
kind of path
All right,
journey
its
here.
shelf life.
Yeah. Wow, we got our audio engineer in the recording with that one. Shelf life was a winner. Cool. Wow, it just made me forget what I was going to say. Okay, no, here's what I was going to say, which is that another thing to keep in mind is that if you're just looking at the overall flow rate of your pump for how long you need to run your pump to get a single turnover, that's also going to be affected by efficiency, which can be from turns in your pipes. It can be from all kinds of the filter equipment that you put after it. So the best way to get the actual flow going through your whole system is by having a flow meter attached. And specifically, there's one that's calibrated. We'll throw it in the show notes like we always do when we bring this up, for float tanks. So it's giving an accurate reading as opposed to inaccurate for regular water. And that, a 50 gallon per minute pump, for example, might only be getting 40 gallons per minute of flow or 35 gallons per minute of flow. And at that point, if you'd just done the straight math from your 50 gallon a minute pump in a 200 gallon float tank, you'd think you'd need 4 minutes to do a turnover and kind of calculate based on that. But what you should actually be calculating off of is the true flow in your system. Otherwise, you'll end up running your pumps for much shorter than you should. So flow meter is really important. Easy repair. Again, we've talked about this before, but we will include some cool show notes.
And checking it is important because something might get clog up the system and lower that number. And you want to fix that, so you're getting these turnovers.
All right. Anyway, I realized we hadn't said that one either for how to actually properly gauge the turnover rate there. Okay.
Okay. So this is where things get kind of unfortunate. This is kind of the edge of the theoretical knowledge on this that you would look at for pools and spas and apply to pools and spas. And this is the point where we have to remind everyone that float tanks are not, in fact, pools and spas, and assumptions that people make for pools and spas may break down when you start talking about float tanks. So in talking to people who are kind of experts in filtration and have studied this stuff and know a lot more about it than we do, they've brought some other things up to us about float tanks that may kind of make this not really make as much sense, or may not have this information be as reliable for us as it is for the pool and spa world, which is, the hydrodynamics of what's going on in a float tank may be different than what's happening in a pool or a spa. We don't have some of the same kind of surface skimming equipment that pools and spas do, just because they're typically really big, literally big size-wise. They're too big to put on float tanks. They're 14 inches tall or something like that. So that's one of the things where we're not...
The shallow end of the pool is always deeper than 11 inches is another way of saying that. Yeah.
So that's one thing that, we're not using some of the same equipment to have that same sort of efficiency of what we're filtering. Pools often balance their intakes to be sucking about, a split of 25-75% from the surface versus from underneath the water. I don't know if float tanks are doing that as the same, or if they really should, because the other weird thing about float tanks is that
everything floats.
Yeah, they float. They're float tanks, right? So it may be much more important for us there may be a lot more on the surface of our systems that would otherwise sink in pools. Certain microorganisms may sink in a pool but float in a float tank.
And I don't know of any research that's been done on this, but it's likely.
Right. But what one person was telling us, cryptosporidium, this one that is a big thing in the pool world that people are always trying to deal with, is a little heavier than water, so it would sink in water, but lighter than what float tanks are, so it would float in float tanks.
Likely float in float tanks.
Yeah. So that's one thing where and their conclusion was that, Gage Bidwell might kind of break down in its logic when we can't assume some of those things. If we can't assume that the same sort of mixing and surface balance and stuff like that is happening in a float tank versus a pool, we probably can't assume that these Gage Bidwell numbers are the same for us. So I don't know. We don't know. Research actually has to be done, and things get specific per float tank and how they design their intakes and outtakes and their skimmers. And you can do tests where you put these little micro beads into your systems and actually see how many of them you're filtering out and stuff like that. But stuff like that's really expensive, and some manufacturer has to pay a lot of money to do a test like that. So that's the sort of data that that we don't have right now, basically, that would help answer some of this stuff.
Yeah. So, we pretty much we do the best that we can with the information that we have. And what we can figure out is how much we're actually pumping, which we can do with a flow meter. We can figure out from that what our actual turnover.
If your flow meter's accurate.
If your flow meter's accurate, which
not all of them are.
Yeah. Again, calibrated flow meter in the show notes. Just a little shout out for that. And yeah, so we have the volume, which means we can calculate turnover time, which means now we can figure out if we had 100% filter efficiency, everything else was acting normal, what percentage we'd expect to be getting with the number of turnovers, how much time we'd take to run those. And that's where we start to get into an actual specific answer for your question of how long should you run a filter for. So
that's the long answer. The short answer is, 15 minutes.
Get out of here. Right? Like, yeah, that was a total joke, by the way. I mean, it ends up that
it was kind of a joke, but it's also kind of like there is a thing that most people are doing, which is
a lot of tank manufacturers are designing their systems to hopefully filter within 15 minutes.
To do 3 turnovers is what a lot of people in the industry consider. What that's basically the current kind of heuristic everyone's using. We do 3 turnovers, and a lot of manufacturers design their systems to accomplish 3 turnovers in around 15 minutes.
Yeah, for sure. And I think like the majority of our tanks at Float On have to run slightly longer times with the pump in order to actually accomplish those 3 turnovers. But
yeah, certainly the ones we've messed with the filtration systems on, we have to run a little bit longer. We didn't quite get them powerful enough.
Yeah. But you never know, right? Like it can be that your tanks are taking longer. Some are actually designed with slower filtration kind of all the way through, and those will actually take longer to run a full cycle. It might be that it's 20 or 30 minutes to get even to 3 turnovers.
And some places require more turnovers. The
4,
state of Washington
5.
requires 4. The state of Florida requires 5.
That's the highest, right? I don't know anyone who's above.
It's the highest I know.
Florida, yeah.
And then there's like Austria that requires reservoir systems. And like parts of Germany, I guess. So there's a couple things like that out there.
Yeah. I don't know specifically on recirculation systems though. I don't know anyone requiring
More
over
than 5.
5.
Yeah, nor do I.
Yeah. Okay. So that's probably the range that you're looking at is between 3 and 5 turnovers. And to me, it's also a little bit of the vote in the confidence of what you're doing further down the road in your filters and UV and what your cleaning schedule is on those, and just like how confident you feel in the rest of your system for 3 to 5, right? I mean, like you could do 3 and have a filter and no UV or something like that.
Oh, sure.
Or you could have like a 10 micron filter versus a 1 micron filter. I mean, these things.
Or chlorine is a residual and is just in the tank regardless of how much your float tank solution's going through the filtration system. So there's definitely other like variables that make this stuff mean different things in terms of sanitation.
Yeah, and the ones that do have something where the disinfection is taking place as part like in line with the pump system, that's where these things like turnovers and getting all of the water through there and efficiency become really important. So if your primary disinfection is UV or ozone.
Yeah, UV especially.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the one
UV
that
especially
has the lowest reach, right? Like UV
because ozone will get blasted through a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit more.
And,
But UV is really like it's got to have contact time in that UV chamber.
And chlorine, you're mainly worried about, getting the hair and oils and things like that out during the system. I mean, they do help pull out other bugs that might be in there, but the chlorine fundamentally should be doing a lot of the heavy lifting for making sure that it's safe.
Cryptosporidium,
right?
Giardia,
which we're not as worried about in float tanks.
Maybe.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you have to swallow it. That is the nice thing about gastrointestinal bugs.
But you only have to swallow 1 oocyst of Cryptosporidium to get sick.
It's a really fun word too, if you want to, and they look really creepy. If you want to not sleep well at night, look up Cryptosporidium oocysts.
It's 2 O's.
Yeah,
weird.
They really look like little demons, like crawling out of an egg. It's really creepy. We'll put one in the show notes. Okay, so we have no idea how long you should run your pump for.
Yeah, basically.
But there's a ton of information for how you can figure it out yourself. You can also probably call the manufacturer, and they'll tell you some information.
But again, some of this is just, this is it. Like, this is as far as some people have figured stuff out. I don't know. Maybe manufacturers have other things they've heard from people and talked to people. So this, again, it's just information at this level gets more vague and conflicting, and there's just different experts out there kind of like giving their opinion, not like us, like different people who are like
much higher level
who actually know what they're talking about. Yeah,
sanitation.
people like who are like filtration experts who are like just taking this in and making a guess at how they think it might work in float tanks. That sort of stuff is bound to be a little bit more kind of variable until we get real data.
Until we get
real
data from float tanks, and we're not trying to generalize a bunch of pool information to it.
Yeah. So,
Good luck.
someday. Yeah. Anyway, this podcast is ending, so.
Yep. Cool. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah. Word.
All right. If you have a few last questions, run, don't walk. Yeah.
Yeah. Get on over. Go to the
hitchhike
website.
a fast ride and take it on down to floatanksolutions.com.
Yep. Type in a / and then a podcast, and you'll be
Hit the
you'll be all
podcast
set.
button right after the / button.
You'll
and
be all set.
Bam.
Boom.
Talk to you tomorrow.
Bye.